Good afternoon, everybody. It's Nate here with Nuview Trust Company. I apologize for not being with you guys live tonight, but duty calls. We are off Nuview with our executive quarterly meeting, talking about how we can make Nuview better, but I wanted to make sure to get this content recorded for you guys, and hopefully my IRA specialist will be able to answer your questions. So let's just jump right into it. And the reason why I want to do this class is I've gotten so many good questions about using leverage to grow your self-directed IRAs. And there's just so many ways that you can use leverage other than just using other people's money, using non-recourse loans. And we're going to talk about some other strategies on using leverage that we haven't necessarily talked about, or maybe we just touched on that we're going to dive a little bit deeper on today. So let's talk about using leverage to grow your self-directed IRAs. If you're new to the program, just a reminder, Nuview Trust Company is a self-directed IRA custodian. What that means is we manage retirement accounts, but we don't sell investments. So that might be different than you're used to if you've got an IRA with Blvd or Charles Schwab, where they're licensed securities brokers selling you investments. There's other companies like Nuview Trust Company that doesn't have investments to sell. But the good side, the upside to that is when we don't sell you investments, we allow you to hold anything in your IRA, but you have to find the investment. That's what's different. So a self-directed IRA is not good for everybody, but it is really good for the guy or the gal who's an entrepreneurial investor at heart, or they have an investment that they'd like to make that doesn't fit inside of a mutual fund or inside of a stock. So things like real estate investments, promissory note investments, oil and gas interests, mineral rights, cryptocurrency, the list goes on and on and on. But if you want to invest your IRA into those alternative assets, you use a company like Nuview Trust Company. So all the information here is for education only. We always encourage you to consult with your legal professionals, tax attorneys, and advisors before entering into any type of investment. When we talk about self-directed IRA, I always have to remind people that self-directed is just a marketing term. And that's the product that we have here at Nuview, but it doesn't make our IRAs any different than an IRA and another custodian. The self-directed is just a marketing term, and the self goes back to you. When you have an IRA or an HSA or an ESA at Nuview Trust Company, the keys are in your hand. You're the driver. We still manage the retirement account so that you get your tax benefits, but you have to pick the investments. So that's where the self-directed part comes from. And most of our clients honestly have IRAs all over the place because they like to have true diversification when it comes to their retirement portfolio. So they might have an IRA with Blvd that holds their stocks and bonds and mutual funds, and then they have an IRA at Nuview Trust Company that holds their real estate or their promissory notes secured by real estate, or all the funky things that we like to do as investors that doesn't fit in the traditional investment world. There's no limit on how many IRAs you can have. There's only a limit on how much you can contribute to an IRA on an annual basis. One thing I will mention, since we're talking about limits on contributions, during this presentation especially, don't get contributions confused with profit. Profit is unlimited, and there's a lot of different creative strategies that are available to us out there that can take small amounts of money and make them larger, but those are profits. That does not go against our annual contribution. So just don't get confused between contribution, what you take out of your back pocket and add to the account each year, and profit, which is what the investment makes within the IRA. But self-directed IRAs allow us to have true diversification by investing in alternative assets. The tax savings are what most people are most intrigued by with an IRA, and different IRAs have different tax benefits when it comes to tax-deferred treatment or tax-free treatment. But at a bare minimum, you're always going to get tax-deferred treatment when you're using things like a traditional IRA or a SEP IRA, a simple IRA, most 401ks. Those are all vehicles that you can buy and sell investments within them and not have to pay capital gains tax on your investments, thus allowing you to grow the bucket much, much faster because you don't have to pay tax annually like you do as an individual. But if you use accounts like a Roth IRA, a Roth 401k, an education savings account, a health savings account, those are accounts that not only grow tax deferred, but if you play your cards right and you take distributions out of the profit, the distributions are tax-free and penalty-free for life. So if you're not utilizing an IRA to some degree and you're just using your own money as a tax-paying individual, you're probably spinning your wheels trying to keep up with the taxation of old Uncle Sam. And that's why it might be harder for people who don't have a retirement account to save for retirement. So tax savings are always a key benefit to any IRA, whether it's self-directed or not. But investing in what you know best is the real power, where the real power comes in, especially with the self-directed IRA. If you're a real estate investor, if you are a oil and gas investor, if you understand mineral rights, if you understand cryptocurrency, my thought to you would be think about what you're knowledgeable about, and maybe you should invest your IRA into that. That doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes, but you will make fewer mistakes investing in the things that you're knowledgeable about versus just investing in things you aren't knowledgeable about. A lot of people invest in the stock market because they're just told to invest in the stock market. But I guarantee you, you ask the average American if they understand how to make money in it, they say no. They just buy it and hope that it goes up. So again, nothing wrong with that investment, but a self-directed IRA lets you invest in what you know best. And when we get to the case studies, you'll see that clients oftentimes are using their experience as a form of leverage to grow their small IRAs and make them much, much larger. So that's definitely a benefit you get with self-direction. The types of plans you can self-direct, there's actually plenty. Most people just think of traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs as the only things that can be self-directed. And it's probably because 70% of Americans have those types of plans when you're talking about US retirement. Most of US retirement plans are in IRAs, specifically rollover IRAs, and that would be mostly traditional IRAs. But you could self-direct other plans as well. If you're self-employed, you work for yourself, you're a business owner, you're a realtor, you're a CPA, you're a real estate attorney, you're a contract worker, you're a property manager, you might work for yourself, you might have employees, you might not. But if you have some self-employment income, you have additional options for self-direction, and you're allowed to make contributions to either a SEP IRA, a simple IRA, or even have your own individual 401k, or some people call it a QRP. And that 401k or QRP can also have a Roth. The advantage to these plans is they allow for larger contributions, money you take out of your pocket and put in. You could put larger amounts of money annually into your employer plans based on your self-employment income than you can with the personal plans like the traditional and the Roth. Reason why I want to make that point is because we are coming up on the tax filing deadlines for employer plans, which is either September 15th or October, depending on the entity that you've got structured. But a lot of clients right now are looking to beat that deadline and put money into a IRA, whether it's a SEP IRA, a simple or a 401k. And so make sure that you understand what those deadlines are so that you can get your 2020 contributions in prior to the deadline. But employer plans like these can also be self-directed, which is very, very important to know. And then you can also contribute and invest health savings accounts with Nuview Trust and Coverdell education savings accounts. Now, these are two really cool accounts that are not IRAs, but they work like IRAs as a tax exempt vehicle. A health savings account, for example, it's not an IRA, but it is a savings account. In order to have a health savings account, you have to have a few things as qualifiers. You have to have what's called a high deductible health plan, or an HDHP. I can't tell you whether you have one or not. Just call your health insurance provider and ask them if your health insurance plan is HSA compatible. And if it is, the health savings account is one of the greatest things on the planet. Reason being is when you make contributions to a health savings plan, you get a tax deduction. So it works like a traditional IRA when you make contributions, right? Dollar for dollar, the money you put in there, you get to write it off to old Uncle Sam. Now, what are the contribution limits on a health savings account? It's based on who's insured on your insurance policy. So if it's just you, it's a single plan, you're the only one covered on your insurance, the contribution limit for an HSA is $3,600. $3,600, dollar for dollar, you get to write that off on your taxes. And you don't need earned income, by the way, to make contributions to an HSA. Okay, you just need to have one and be qualified to have one. But it doesn't stop there with the tax savings on an HSA. Not only do you get the deduction on the contribution, but you get to invest the money in the HSA completely tax-deferred. And you could take distributions at any time. You don't have to wait until 59.5. You could take distributions, and the distributions can be tax-free and penalty-free, provided you're using that distribution to pay for qualified out-of-pocket health expenses. So these are very, very broad, and it's usually the things that are health related that your insurance doesn't cover. So it might be things like prescriptions, doctor's visits, co-pays, dental, vision. There's a long list of health related expenses that can be paid out of your distributions of your HSA, thus giving you the ability to consume more goods with the same amount of profit because you get Uncle Sam out of the equation. So just think, if you've got $5,000 of health expenses and you're using the money in your back pocket as a taxpayer, that doesn't just cost you $5,000. That costs you more like $8,000 because you got to make $8,000 and then pay taxes and be left with $5,000 to consume and health expenses in that amount. Just switch your mindset as an investor. If you've got an investment, use an HSA to be the owner of that investment, or use the HSA to partner on an investment with your other IRAs. Therefore, if you make the same $8,000 you would have, but you make it to the HSA, the $8,000 is all available to pay for health expenses because the same thing can be said for the Coverdell Education Savings Account. These are wonderful accounts that can be self-directed, but the specific tax benefit is for a beneficiary that would be a child, most likely a minor. So a Coverdell Education Savings Account, you set one up for any of your kids or grandkids, or they don't even have to be your kids, just a child under the age of 18. You can make contributions to a minor's Coverdell Education Savings Account, or we'll just call it a CISA, Coverdell Education Savings Account. The contributions are relatively small, $2,000 per child per year. You can make contributions all the way until they're 18. The account lives, though, until the child reaches age 30. Once the child reaches age 30, if there's still money left over in the account that hasn't been used to pay for qualification expenses, you can just distribute the rest of the money to the child or pass the beneficial interest of what's left down to another child, provided that child is just under the age of 30. And what can the distributions of the profit be used to pay for? Qualified education expenses from kindergarten all the way through college. So that would be things like if your kids are going to private school, tuition, uniforms, if they're not going to private school, things like books, computers, iPads, tutoring, even your home internet bill and cabling is a qualified education expense. So if you think about the expenses you pay as a parent, getting your kids educated, and if you're using the money in your back pocket, or I like to call hip national, well, realize how less of the amount of goods you can consume because you're paying taxes on that money. If you're an investor, again, switch your mindset. Maybe there's an investment that I can incorporate my kids or grandkids' Coverdell Education Savings accounts in. That way the profit's not taxed that comes with those accounts, and thus the parent gets to consume more education expenses because they get Uncle Sam out of the equation. The reason I'm spending a little bit of time on these plans is because the topic of today is leverage, okay? Using different strategies to take small amounts of money and make them larger. Because the health savings account and the Coverdell, they're relatively new ideas. They've been around for a long time, but most people are setting them up for the first time, especially the Coverdell, and the contributions are relatively small. You've got to get creative. But I've seen people take $100 in a son's Coverdell and turn it into 40 grand in 8 weeks using their knowledge as an investor to flip a contract or do a real estate option, but they're doing it within their son's Coverdell education account so that they can consume more goods, applying their knowledge to a tax-exempt account like the Coverdell. So I'll get off my soapbox for now, but I will remind people that all 7 accounts can be self-directed individually or self-directed together. So that's where the true power in these accounts comes from, is when you start partnering these accounts together. So for example, if you've got a Roth IRA for yourself, a Roth IRA for your spouse, you're self-employed, maybe you have a SEP IRA or even an individual 401k along with that. Maybe you have a high deductible health plan for you and the family, so you've got an HSA as well. Maybe you have 3 kids that each have ESAs. Those are all tax exempt vehicles that are going to get treated better when it comes to taxation than you ever will as a person. And if you can partner those accounts together and get them all moving, well, then you have profit coming back pro rata that fit different purposes. The money going back to your IRAs and retirement accounts is for later that you can leave tax-free after 59 and a half. And the money pro rata coming back to your HSAs and your ESAs can be used today to pay for real life expenses that you're incurring today. So the power in partnering is real. You can invest these things individually or separate. And you might want to think maybe there are some investments that are better suited for maybe just your HSA or just your ESA. And that might be investments that maybe turn a quick profit. So that's something to think about. If it's an investment that might profit later, maybe that's not best for an ESA because you want the profit to pay for education expenses you're incurring today. But maybe that's better in your Roth because you've got a little bit of time on that investment. But if it's something where it's a quick turnaround, right, and you're using leverage, well, depending on your needs, maybe you need that money right now to pay for education expenses or even health expenses. So again, everybody's different and you can use these accounts separately and individually. And hopefully these case studies that we've got coming up will kind of give you some ideas on how you can more better utilize those. So what do clients use those accounts to invest in? Well, all sorts of things. The IRS does not tell us what we are allowed to invest in. They only tell us what we're not allowed to invest in. And the list is really short. The only two investments you're not allowed to own in a retirement account or an IRA is life insurance contracts and collectibles. That's it. Everything else is fair game. So as a general rule of thumb, if you can own title to something, the title can be owned in the name of your IRA, your Roth IRA, your SEP IRA, your HSA, your ESA, or a combination of all of them. Here's some of the investments we see people do when it comes to real estate. They buy real estate through foreclosures, they buy tax liens or tax certificates, they pool IRAs together to buy apartment buildings, they do real estate options, they buy condos, they buy land, they buy commercial property. We have a lot of clients that like to be more passive with their retirement. They like to invest into entities, maybe trust investments, joint ventures, which we're going to talk about today, partnerships, investments into LLCs. And a lot of times these entities are actually holding real estate within them, or they might be running a business. You know, I've seen people invest their IRAs into, an LLC that was running an ice cream shop. It doesn't matter to us at Nuview what you invest in. It really just comes down to what are you knowledgeable about and what are you comfortable with. But you can get as creative as you want. And I think that's one of the fun things about using a self-directed IRA. And when we talk about things like joint ventures, which we're going to talk about in a second. The other thing clients like to do is just invest passively. We've done a lot of education on this, talking about notes, talking about investing in secured notes, and that would be secured property. So they just use their IRA like a bank. You call their IRA a hard money lender at that point. Or they do unsecured notes where the money's not secured by something. You can do net profit notes, shared appreciation notes, convertible notes. There's a whole list of creative note strategies, even buying existing notes, whether they're non-performing or performing existing notes. Again, the choice is yours when it comes to self-direction. We basically just act as your custodian. We sign the documents, but ultimately it's you that decides what you want held in your IRA. So before we get to the case studies and show you how you can use leverage, let's just talk about the process real quick. So how do you take an IRA typically in most situations and start investing into these alternative assets that we're going to talk about? Well, first is you just have to open a self-directed IRA, right? There's other companies that do what Nuview does, but they all suck, so just use us. So that's my pitch for Nuview. Okay? Now, and I say that jokingly, but Nuview's been around since 2003. We've got 11,000 clients. We've got close to $2 billion under management. We've seen every investment strategy known to man. So when it comes to investing through a self-directed IRA, invest with or use a company that understands the investments. That's not going to be shocked when you submit, a contract when you're buying property subject to, or a joint venture between two different IRAs. We've seen all that. So you open a self-directed IRA with Nuview. Our fees are fantastic. Our service is fantastic. And again, we've been around the block. We're not a new kid on the block here. Once you open and establish a self-directed IRA, and to do that, you just talk to one of my IRA specialists. They're available basically on call anytime you need them. Talk to one of them, find out what accounts are best for you. They'll help you get the accounts established. And a lot of times we don't even charge you to get the account open. We do a lot of promos to get you guys encouraged to set these accounts up. And the next step, once you open the self-directed IRA or IRAs, is you fund it. There's a couple different ways you can fund it. You can fund it with a transfer from an existing IRA. So if you've got, X amount of dollars at Fidelity, and you want to move that over to a self-directed IRA here in Nuview, all we do is fill out a transfer form. We fax it to Fidelity. They wire the money over. Really easy, not even reported to the IRS. You're just doing a trustee to trustee transfer. If you've got an old employer plan, like an old 401k, an old 403b, a TRS plan, a TSP, and you have separation of service from that employer, you can roll those funds into a self-directed IRA. Again, just like you would roll it into an IRA at Fidelity. It's no different when it comes to the IRA rules. Or you could just make a contribution. Now that's probably more in line if you're opening ESAs, right? Most people don't transfer ESAs to us. Most people hear about ESAs for the first time when they're a client with us. We had a night with Nuview event, which is awesome. And I did a little speech on HSAs and ESAs, and even current clients forgot that we even have these accounts. So a lot of times if you're setting these accounts up for the first time, whether it's an HSA, ESA, or maybe you're just setting up a Roth for the first time, the other way you can fund it is make a contribution to your plan here, which is just sending Nuview a check. Once you've got the account open and funded, then where the self comes in with self-directed is you locate the investment. A lot of people say, well, Nate, where do I find my investment? I unfortunately can't tell you where, or I don't have investments to sell you, but a good place to start would be your local RIAs. I know a lot of our clients here in Florida are members of Go RIA, CFRI, Jacksonville RIA, Tampa RIA, right? They're finding investments through their RIA groups, and therefore they find investments to put in their self-directed IRAs. That's a good place to start. There's a lot of meetup groups. There's a lot of online groups. There's a lot of places that you can find off-market deals, but that's part of the entrepreneurial self part of self-directed is you locate the investment, and then we fund the investment using your IRA funds, okay? There is a little bit of a process where you need to make sure that the contracts and the agreements are named in the name of your IRAs or HSAs, and we walk you through that process. But basically, everything that you draft as far as a purchase is in the name of your IRAs or your HSAs or ESAs. Okay? You do the legwork. You quarterback the deal. We sign off on everything as the IRA custodian, and then we send the money directly from Nuview to, say, the title company, attorney's office, to the borrower, wherever it is. We're not giving you the money as a distribution and you run off and take the money because that isn't what you want. Again, we're exchanging assets of cash for assets of real estate based on your instructions. And then when you sell the investment, it goes back from an asset of real estate to an asset of cash. No different than when Fidelity transfers or converts assets of cash to assets of stocks. So once you get the process down, I mean, it really takes just one time for you to go through the process, and it's just like riding a bike. And then how do you track those investments? You just track them through your online portal. You can track the activity, money coming in, rental incomes coming in, interest payments coming in, and money going out as well. So that's a quick just overview of how the process works. Well, let's talk about using leverage. And I did use this slide last week. You're not watching a rerun here, but it is kind of an expansion on using leverage. And we're going to talk not about non-recourse lending and things like that. We talked a lot about that. If you're interested in that, just go back to our previous classes. We've got a ton on that, but we're going to talk about other ways to use leverage because there's just so many ways. And even this class doesn't touch on all the ways that you can use leverage, but I did add some new case studies that I like. So when we talk about using leverage, remember, it's not just about using money as leverage. That's obviously one of the bigger ways to use leverage, but with the self-directed IRA, you do get to leverage your experience. If you're a real estate investor, your experience comes into play with your retirement assets. You'll make yourself better returns investing that way. If your experience is real estate, why do you invest in the stock market? Or vice versa. So experience is one thing most of these cases you'll see as use of leverage, but then also network. Remember, self-directed IRAs is an entrepreneurial type IRA. You got to get out there and network to find investments. I will tell you, we are getting back to giving some platforms so that people can network again, which would be our live classes and our quarterly mixers. And we'll talk about that at the end. But you want to network outside of the Nuview events too. Again, local and local meetings will help you find investments. Even your sphere of influence, right? Friends and family come into play when it comes to network. And then when you're talking about your IRA's investments, sometimes time is on your hands. And that's something you want to think about. You can get really creative with time frames. And again, I kind of mentioned it. If your investment's going to turn over a quick profit, maybe that's best suited for your ESAs for your kids. So you can pay for education expenses you're incurring that year. Maybe it's if you've got some health expenses, if you got to pay for a root canal, maybe you do a quick investment in your HSA so you can pay for your root canal tax-free. And by the way, get a tax deduction when you make the contribution. So basically making that root canal almost free based on the way the HSA works. And your experience as an investor, but there's all sorts of fun ways that you can utilize leverage to help grow your IRAs. And let's just jump into it and talk about partnering first. This is the easiest way that clients use to maximize their tax savings with the accounts that are available to them. And I would say that if you are a parent and you've got kids, why are you not using a ESA? That would be my first question. If you've got a kid that has education expenses, why are you not utilizing the ESA? Is it because the contribution limits are so small? Is it because you have a 529 plan? Again, nothing against 529 plans, but 529 plans, you don't get to self-direct. It's a great account for as a savings tool, right? But it's state sponsored, right? They pick the investments and the yields are relatively small, 5 to 8%, I think is the average nationally on a 529 plan. If you're an investor that can take a bucket of money and turn more than 5 or 8%, would you want to do that and have those profits tax-free so you can pay for your child's education expenses? So here's just a real basic example of two clients actually three clients, if you count the ESA, how they just use their money and leverage of money from other accounts in their network, which was themselves, the household, to buy and flip a property using 3 different accounts. So basically, Robert and Linda both had Nuview Roth IRAs. And what they did is these started as traditional IRAs. Now, both of them these were rollover IRAs from previous employers that they had. They were both traditional IRAs at Fidelity. And what happened is they were watching a lot of the classes and they decided, hey, I want to use my IRAs and I want to buy some rental property or a flip. And they actually found this property that was vacant near their neighborhood. They actually found out through a neighbor who the owner was. They contacted the owner. The owner said that they were willing to, let go of the property for a pretty good price. So as they were doing their legwork finding this property, they thought, why don't we use our IRAs to buy this, right? This is just an investment. We don't need the money necessarily today, but this also an investment that they're really getting a really good deal on. So if you're going to walk into profit, do you want that profit taxed? And that's what they were thinking after watching a lot of our classes. They thought, well, let's not do this in a traditional IRA and be taxed on all the profit. Let's do a conversion first. Let's convert our traditional IRAs to a Roth IRA and have the profit all tax-free. So what they did is they transferred their traditional IRAs from Fidelity to Nuview. They had Nuview convert those to Roth because we don't charge for conversion. So it didn't cost them anything to do it. Now, it does cost them the taxes that they have to pay on the conversion, but they don't even have to consider that taxation until tax time. So they did this conversion early in the year, but they don't even get a 1099 until the following January. So after the end of the year is when they'll have to pony up and pay the tax on the conversion. But you'll see why it made sense to do this conversion. So they converted it to Roth. And then what they did is they also set up a Coverdell Education Savings account. Was 9, who was basically in elementary school, and it was private school. So, and they were paying for tuition and uniforms and books and all these things. And they wanted to actually open an account for their son and actually get it involved in the same investment. Okay, so they opened up a Coverdell Education account and used their 2 Roths as well. So when they made an offer to purchase the property, they basically put 3 buyers on the contract. Okay. They used the husband's IRA, Roth IRA, they used the wife's Roth IRA, and they used the Coverdell Education Savings Account. And I apologize, this was a couple of years back because they had made a couple of years contributions to the Coverdell. So they already had $6,500 in the Coverdell that they had been making contributions to. Now, the property that they were looking to buy was only $100,000. I'm just using rough estimates. And they estimated that it would take about $30,000 to repair. It wasn't much in repairs. They needed some new paint, new windows. Not much. Foundation was good, roof was good. So it didn't cost much, but all in was about $130,000. Now, when you're partnering accounts together, one thing that I will mention is that make sure that you have enough cash in reserves or the ability to make contributions in the event you have some added expenses that exceed what you anticipate for repairs. Because here's what happens when you partner. When you partner your accounts together, husband, wife, and son's Coverdell, you're all considered disqualified people to one another. Now, what that means is that you can't transact with each other. Okay? You can't move money from one bucket to another, but you can partner together as long as the investment is parallel from beginning to end. And by parallel, it means in this situation, the husband's Roth going in, okay, was 60% owner, okay? The wife's Roth IRA was a 35% owner going in, and the Coverdell Education Savings Account was a small 5% owner. When expenses come up, you have to pay for expenses in those same percentages. So you just have to make sure that you work your numbers right. And the reason I'm saying that, let's say the Coverdell, you exhaust all the funds in the Coverdell, including the contribution. What happens if you need to make a repair? Well, the Coverdell, you can't make another contribution. There's no more money in there. So make sure your percentages give you a little bit of leeway so that in the event of a repair, an added repair that you don't foresee, or maybe an added vacancy on the property, that you have at least a little a plan B where you can make the contribution to either of the plans so that they can account for their qualified expenses that they got to pay. So just a little food for thought there. So on the contract, this is how it read, okay? They didn't set up a fancy entity, they didn't use an LLC, they didn't use any of that. They basically just put 3 buyers on the contract, and those buyers read Nuview Trust Company FBO, Robert Jones, Roth IRA 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in parentheses, it says add as to an undivided interest of 60%. These same parentheses are also on the deed, by the way, okay? There's no liens on this property, they didn't get a loan. But on the property, they're all joint owners, okay, with individual percentages. Now, the percentages are just important more for us than anything, because as they get profit on this investment, if it's rental income, the renter just pays one check back to Nuview, but the check needs to be split pro rata based on their ownership percentages, okay? So they put 3 names on the contract. Again, Robert Jones is a Roth IRA, Nuview Trust Company FBO, Linda Jones, and Nuview Trust Company Max Jones, ESA, that should be ESA, I apologize, it's a typo, ESA, into the undivided interest of 5%. That's it, getting multiple accounts working together, and this investment worked out pretty well for them, okay? They used that $30,000 to fix the property up. Obviously, that went directly to a contractor that did the labor. They didn't do the fix or nothing. That would be prohibited, obviously. They just quarterbacked the deal and put the pieces together. So the contractor did all the work. And 4 months later, they sold the property for $189,900, okay, giving them approximately, after closing costs, $180,000 of net proceeds. Because they went in 130,000, it was actually a little bit less, okay, but it gave them a tax-free gain of approximately $50,000. How's that $50,000 split? Pro rata, based on the ownership percentages. So the husband's Roth IRA took a total of $30,000 of tax-free profit that can be invested, again, completely free of capital gains. The wife's Roth IRA, same thing, $17,500 went to her Roth IRA, again, for later down the road, but can continue to be invested. But they took another $2,500 of tax-free dollars that they immediately withdrew to pay for a part of the young Max's tuition. So, and all we did was send a $2,500 check directly from Nuview straight to the school. We didn't even have to send it to the parents. They just said, we need to pay $2,500. So what they did there is they just used their ability to contribute to Max's account, okay, took an investment that they were going to invest in anyways, but took Uncle Sam out of the equation and was able to consume immediately $2,500 of education expenses for their son, and they didn't have to worry about any taxation to them, okay? And they continue to invest, and they continue to invest, and they have another child that on the way, so they're going to open an ESA once they have a social security number. I always get that. Can I set up a ESA for a child that's not born yet? Unfortunately not. They have to have a identifiable social security number that we tie it to. But the cool thing is you have the ability to set up ESAs for each of your children or your grandchildren, and partnering those accounts together is a way to maximize the advantage of the accounts and maximize the tax ability. Now, could they have thrown an HSA in there? Sure, they could have, because they throw an ESA or a SEP in there. Sure, they could have. It just may change the ownership percentages. But again, very, very easy to do. And this is the most basic way clients partner accounts together. Let's talk a little bit more creative there. Let's talk about partnering by use of a joint venture. Now, a lot of you real estate investors, active real estate investors, have done a joint venture with people before. Maybe you were the one doing all the sweat equity, but you found somebody that had some money laying aside. Maybe it was in an IRA, maybe it wasn't. And you used their capital, okay, as the capital source, and you did the sweat equity, and you set up a joint venture agreement. Maybe you split the profits 50-50 with your capital partner. Maybe you split it 80-20, who knows? But joint ventures are a good kind of clean way to take a bucket of money from here, a bucket of money or sweat equity here, put them together and buy a property. Now, there are some pros and cons with any setup that you make, so I will talk about that a little bit here. But a joint venture is different than a lender-borrower situation. Okay? Even if somebody is the sweat equity, if you're doing a joint venture, you're partners. Okay? Partnership is different. There's goods and bads with the partnership. Okay? But in this next case study, we'll see how they partnered using a joint venture agreement, and they use their experience, money, and network to make this investment happen. So this is a client that had an HSA, okay, HSA from an old employer. They had not invested the HSA for years. I find it interesting that most people who have HSAs just use it as a savings account that they put money in and they get the tax deduction, but they don't never invest it. Again, you get one side of the tax benefit, which is the contributions, but if you're not investing it, you're missing out on the other side of it, which is the tax-free growth. So they had an HSA that they just found out that they can use. They found this property, and when I say not in good shape, I say the property was horrible. Okay? It was basically not even a house. It was like barely a roof. This was a property in kind of it was in a good area, but this was abandoned. It was like that house that like people stay out of the yard, right? People don't know who owns that house, right? So they found this property through their mailers and the things that they do because they're an active real estate investor. But they found this property and they said, you know what? Let me buy this property because there's probably a lot of upside to this. And I don't have, their money was out into other deals, but they had this small HSA and they decided, let me just buy this property in the HSA. And I think I can make something happen, but I just want to get it under contract. So they ended up buying this property, this eyesore really for $12,500 owned in their HSA. Now, from that point on, the HSA didn't really have much money in it. And even the contributions, even if they made a $3,600 contribution, to it, what are you going to do with that? You don't have enough to rehab it. So they could have gone out and maybe got a non-recourse lender to come in and pay for a rehab. But most non-recourse lenders are not going to want to be that risky on an investment that there's no income being produced on the property. It's a heavy rehab. And even if you did find a lender that's willing to do that, you're going to have UBIT. You're going to have a pretty significant unrelated debt finance income tax. If this investment is worth a lot more and you're using, the majority of the money to rehab it from a lender. So what happened is they started going to events, they networked, they actually ran into another Nuview client, and you would be shocked by how many Nuview clients have cash sitting in their accounts uninvested. We've got about 150 million on any given day that sits undirected in cash. Now that's a large majority of clients that have just moved money over. Maybe they just sold an investment and it's sitting there in undirected cash. So they've got to figure out what to invest it in. So this client that owned a property in his HSA found another client that had money sitting there in a traditional IRA and said, hey, let's partner together and maybe build this property back from scratch and split the profits. So what they ended up doing is they formed a joint venture agreement. Now, a joint venture agreement is specific to one investment, okay? And you usually have two parties. A lot of times it's a sweat equity partner and a capital partner, but it could be two capital partners. And in this case, it was a small capital partner, the one that owned the land or the property. And then the traditional IRA, which was going to come in with the majority of the money, and all that money was going to be used to bulldoze the property and basically build from there on up. Now, but this was in a good area. So $100,000 invested in this is a large rehab, but you'll see that they panned out really well in what happened. So joint venture agreement stated that the HSA that owned the land and the traditional IRA that was coming in with the rehab, they were going to split the profits after rehab's done, and they sold it. They were going to split it right down the middle, 50-50. Now, it doesn't have to be 50-50. This is completely up to the two partners to agree upon what's right for each partner, and that makes it creative and that makes it fun. So the property was fixed up and then sold 18 months later for $239,900. Okay. Since they split the profit 50-50, there was about $100,000 in profit realized on this investment. Okay. So, and the rehab did take a lot longer than they thought. But again, this is in their HSA and their ESA, but the profits realized in 18 months. So the HSA, after this property was sold, took half of the $100,000 as profit. That's completely tax-free to the HSA. Since that goes back to the HSA, they could use that immediately if they wanted to pay for qualified out-of-pocket health expenses. Here's the other cool thing with the HSA is that it's the only account that you can do this with. You can actually just leave the profit in there and continue to reinvest it, okay? If you have the HSA and the HDHP in place, let's say for 10 years, you can actually pay for out-of-pocket expenses and just use your money and save all the receipts. And then just use whatever profit you've made of the HSA to just reimburse yourself later, pay yourself back. It's really flexible, and it gets confused with that flexible spending account that's not flexible. The flexible spending account is not like an HSA. And I know you guys know what I mean when I talk about FSA. The FSA, if you don't use the money by the end of the year, you lose it. The HSA, you can continue to invest it. You never lose the money, and you can even pay yourself back later. Now, the catch is you can only pay yourself back from your HSA for expenses that you incurred while you have the HSA and the HDHP in place. So once you go off of the high deductible health insurance, any expenses you incur in that time, you can't pay yourself back for that. But anytime you have the HDHP in place and you incur those expenses, you can pay yourself back. So you can go 10 years, 20 years, 50 years based on the rules and keep the capital in there, grow it exponentially. And again, the power in that is because you have more capital, you got more buying power, you can grow it faster, yada, yada, yada. But the cool thing is he made $50,000 of tax-free profit that he can use today, later, down the road, whatever. And that's all the HSA. And the traditional IRA didn't do bad either. Even though it's tax deferred, it took $100,000 and made 50. Okay, it made a 50% return in 18 months based on the fact that it was able to joint venture with another IRA, or in this case, HSA, that owned a property that bought it for only $12,500. So be cautious with this though. With good relationships and trust between the IRA owners, this can be a good strategy. If you are not familiar with the other party, be careful of doing a joint venture because you have a partnership. You have to contend with each other. You have to work well within one another. Just because the IRA that put up $100,000 put up most of the capital doesn't mean they have more control over the investment. Okay, they're an equal partner on this investment. And it's not like it's a lender-borrower agreement where if one party doesn't perform, you get to just deep foreclose on the property. So there are goods and bads to this, okay? It's also, again, you got to weigh out your risk on this. Because if you're the $100,000 capital partner and you're not a lender-borrower position, remember, you can't foreclose on it. So you got to make sure that you guys are in line with what you want to do with this property, okay? And if there is a agreement that 50-50 of the profits are split, what happens if the investment loses? What happens if it doesn't make money? Well, 50% of the loss is also, or 50% of the loss is again, 50% shared by you guys. So again, be cautious with it, make sure that it's right for the right situation. But here's the real cool thing about joint ventures. Because you're not a lender and because the IRA, or in this case, the HSA didn't borrow money, it's not debt leveraged, there's no UDFI. So if you want to get past that UDFI tax that we talk about, when your IRA leverages money through a loan, this is leveraging money not through a loan. This is leveraging money as a partnership, and there's no UDFI on partnership. So just food for thought. All right, moving on. Last one that I want to talk about is a real estate option contract. And this is a new real estate option contract of a friend of mine. And again, this one is a crazy one, but I guarantee you it's real because I even verified the numbers and verified the account because I just had to, okay? And we talked about real estate option contracts on the last show. And again, just to recap, a real estate option contract is defined as a one-way contract, okay? A real estate option contract gives a buyer, okay, first right to buy a specific property in exchange for consideration. And consideration is in cash. So you can give a seller, okay, or owner of a property consideration up front in exchange of an option. The option is the first right to buy that property. Now you have to be very careful with real estate options. I encourage you to deal with an attorney who drafts these specifically because in an option contract, there's a lot of flexibility in it, but you have to be very specific with the terms. An option contract has to have a firm and specific price. Okay, consideration is one thing, but the purchase price is different. They could be the same, but again, they're two different things. But you also have to be specific on the time, and that's very, very important. Okay, when is the option period elapse? Okay, when's the option period good for? But in certain circumstances, this works well for both parties. Okay, so in this certain case, what happened, and I'll give you the backstory real quick, is this is a real estate investor who's an active real estate investor who worked in a specific neighborhood for 2 decades. Now, this real estate investor was known in the area for being the one to be able to help people with their problems if it came to problems with their real estate. So this case came where a nice lady, way past retirement age, she was close to 80 years old, had lived in her house forever. It was owned free and clear in the outskirts of town, okay, in a pretty rough area of town for the most part, but the area was up and coming, right? And this is an area where there was no zoning law. So her $30,000 house, which was a hoarder house, by the way, sat next to a brand new school, sat next to a new apartment building that was being built, sat next to a fire station. There was all sorts of things that were being built around this neighborhood, and it was being basically redeveloped. And she had owned this property for many years, and she just fell on some hard times, and she hadn't paid her property taxes. But this went on for years. 5 years she hadn't paid her property taxes. So she was getting obviously almost put out on the street by the county assessor, and she had nowhere to go. She had no family in town. She didn't know what to do. She had no job. She had no income. She had nothing for her to come up with the money to pay for her past due property. So she approached the real estate investor and said, I've got a problem. Real estate investor said, well, I definitely don't want your hoarder house, but I do want to help you out. So what they did is they ended up agreeing to an option contract. Okay. The option contract gave him, or in this case, his Roth IRA, the first right to buy her property after 2 years. It was very specific. Okay, from the date of exchange of the consideration, he had 2 years to exercise his option. Now, in the contract or in the agreement, the option contract price was $10,000. So it was basically the equivalent of what he gave her as consideration. Now, what she did with that money is she used it to pay the property taxes. She kept a little bit for herself. And as a part of the agreement, he allowed her to stay in the house for the 2 years. Okay. So what this gives the investor the right to do, though, is they basically have 4 exit strategies with this. They can either exercise the option at the specific option price before the option period expires. They can let the option expire, which sometimes that's best case scenario. I don't want the house. You can keep the consideration. So you are at risk of losing your consideration at that point. Or they can assign the option to another investor. Some people just assign options, like it's like wholesaling contracts. Okay? And an option contract is a lot more tangible of his investment than just flipping a contract, I would say. So you can assign your option to another investor for a fee, or in some cases, you can cancel the option. A lot of times the canceling of the option comes from the request of the seller, right? They decide to stay in the house, they get back on their feet, they money that they didn't know they had. So they pay to cancel the option and stay in the house. But it's a one-way contract because the owner of the option, the buyer, doesn't have to execute on the agreement. They don't have to exercise the agreement. But if they do, the owner has to agree to it. That's why it's called a one-way contract. So here's what happened. 2 years goes by, okay? She got what she needed. She stayed in the house. She didn't have to go on the street. She found family to move in with up north. And now he needed to figure out what he wanted to do with this property, okay? He exercised the option. He basically said, okay, I'll take ownership of this property. I already gave you the $10,000, so I don't have to give you any more. But now he's got this hoarder house owned in his Roth IRA at that point. He didn't have any more money in the Roth IRA to do any development. And the development that was going on in this area, by the way, was not small-time development. It was townhomes, triplexes, multifamily apartment buildings, commercial property. So he had to keep up with the time. So what he ended up doing is he found through his network, he found a real estate developer. Now, it's very important. You can't be the real estate developer. You can't partner with your own IRA. That would be disqualified. But he knew of another real estate developer and said, basically same thing. They drew up a joint venture agreement saying if this real estate developer came in with all the funds to rehab this, basically they had to demo the property and they built up a couple different, because the land was pretty big. They ended up building 3 properties, 3 townhomes on this property, and they did a joint venture agreement. Same thing, split the profit 50-50. Now remember, all that the Roth IRA had to come in to get this property was $10,000. The bulk of the money came in from the real estate developer that came in and leveled the property and built 3 townhomes on that plot of land. The properties were sold, okay, years later for $315,000 each. And because the joint venture agreement gave the Roth IRA 50% of those profits, the Roth IRA netted tax-free $297,000 in 6. That is a real case study. Now, is that a home run? Heck yeah, I would say that's a home run. But what did he leverage? He leveraged his experience. He leveraged his knowledge of IRAs, his knowledge of real estate options, his network, because he had an established relationship in his community as being able to solve problems. And he used his network of knowing another real estate developer. Here's a caveat to this story. Years later, after this investment was done and after they built the property and after they sold the properties off, the lady came back and tried to sue, said that he took advantage of her through his real estate experience and did all this and made all this money and didn't give her any of it. And they actually went to court. And when the judge looked at the option contract, he said, this is tangible, this is valid. You took your consideration and you walked from the property. He did nothing wrong. He just did what he needed to do as a real estate investor. So moral of the story is use your knowledge, use your experience. Use good contracts. They will save you, especially in things like that where people try to come back and take your profit. But this is a good way to take a small amount of money. So again, when people say, well, I don't have a lot of money, well, I only have $25,000 in my Roth IRA. Look what this guy did with $10,000. And would you want to do this in a traditional IRA? Heck no. Why would you want to pay taxes on $297,000? This is a perfect example of where you would want to convert to a Roth or start with a Roth, or start with an ESA or an ESA, and think if he had kids, think if we would have partnered in an ESA on that. That's college paid for in a couple of years based on your experience and based on the knowledge of these accounts. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. And just if you're asking what the yield on that is, I'll show you what the yield on that is. I did it on the calculator. It is too high. It's just too high to calculate. So again, use your knowledge. You can surpass things that go off in the stock market. And again, I hope this kind of gain an understanding and at least give you some ideas on what you can do and how you can leverage your people, your money, your IRAs, your tax savings, yada, yada, yada. And if you're looking for more ways to network and find people that might be able to be partners with you, come to our live class, September 16th, 6 p.m. We're going to start right here, 280 South Ronald Reagan Boulevard in Longwood, Florida. It's going to be our first live class, or actually second live class of the year, but we're going to start doing this on a monthly basis, and it's going to be the 3rd Thursday of every month. We'll also stream it, but it's better to be live because you get the networking aspect. You don't get the networking aspect online, but you can watch the class. 6 p.m. to 6:30, we're going to start with networking. 6:30 is when the class starts, and we'll go till 8 o'clock, and I'll have some new case studies in there. So I encourage anybody who's new to this, come to this one. If you don't have IRAs or you want to start out and you're new, don't be afraid. This is the class for you. And even if you're experienced, I think this is a good class to come to too, because it really just suits, a lot of people's interests. So making big bucks with small accounts, that's going to be September 16th. Scan that QR code so you can register, or just go online, go to our education center on our website. That's nuviewtrust.com, and you can find a way to register right through there. Stay up to date with us. Go to our YouTube channel, be a subscriber, follow us on Facebook so you get the recurring notifications when we go live. And you can follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn. We're always very active. Again, scan the QR code there. I go right to our social media pages. And I will tell you, we are in the last week of our promo for the end of the summer. And that is, if you want to open an account, unlimited accounts, you can open unlimited accounts for just $50. Normally it's $50 per account. But if you want to open a Roth for yourself, Roth for your spouse, Roth for your kids who have earned income, ESAs, HSAs, SEPs, Simples, 401ks, we're waiving the account opening fee. All you got to do is pay one account opening fee. You can open as many accounts as you want after that. And that includes brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews. Again, since we're talking about partnering, think about all the people that you can encourage to set up accounts, and maybe you can do some wonderful things by using other people's money. And again, we'll make it advantageous to you guys. If you want to set them up for the same time, we'll make it cost efficient for you guys. So I hope that helps you guys. Make sure to use, sorry, it's not Jax 2021. I apologize, that's the wrong promo code, but just contact my IRA specialist at iraspecialist@nuviewtrust.com. And they will reach back out to you. Again, that's IRA specialists with an S at the end support@nuviewtrust.com. Send them an email, say, I want my free accounts, and we'll get right back to you and get those accounts established for you guys. So thanks for staying up to date with us. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next Wednesday.